Jim Barnett was what you'd get if a Wall Street executive learned to speak in wrestling promos and fired people with a smile. A national promoter with southern roots and velvet venom in his voice, Barnett didn't scream, didn't punch, didn't cut wild locker room promos. He just slowly pulled the rug out from under people while sipping wine in a private suite. Georgia Championship Wrestling was his kingdom, until it wasn't. And when his crown slipped, Barnett didn't just move on. He made sure to drag down every name who crossed, betrayed, embarrassed, or simply annoyed him on the way out. This wasn't the heat of a wrestler protecting his spot. This was the cold, surgical hate of a man with TV contracts in one hand and grudges tattooed on the other. His enemies weren't stiff workers or bad hands, they were threats. They stole shares, leaked secrets, turned on him mid-boardroom, and some just said no at the wrong moment. These 5 men didn't get worked into a storyline, they got worked into a vendetta. And when Barnett blackballed you, you didn't just lose bookings, you lost entire territories. So light the cigar, adjust the silk tie, and let's talk about the 5 real-life people Jim Barnett wanted out of the business. Because when he said, "My boy," you better hope he meant it. If you wanted to see Jim Barnett genuinely lose his polished composure, say the name Ole Anderson. The shoot heat between them was so deep, it didn't need chairs thrown or promos cut, just cold corporate bloodletting. Ole wasn't just Barnett's booker in Georgia Championship Wrestling. He was the guy who pulled the political trigger to force Barnett out of his own company. That wasn't business. That was betrayal. The tension dated back years. Ole thought Barnett was manipulative. Barnett thought Ole was a knuckle-dragging caveman with a pen. Ole accused Barnett of embezzlement behind the scenes and said he treated the GCW territory like his personal piggy bank. Barnett, in return, once dismissed Ole as someone who couldn't sell a TV time slot if it was on fire. These two weren't frenemies. They were real-life combatants in a territory war. When GCW's power structure cracked in 1983, it was Ole who rallied the troops, along with other shareholders, to oust Barnett completely, and not just with a vote. He aired dirty laundry, made accusations about shady business practices, and turned boardrooms into bar fights. Even after Barnett left, the hate lingered. And when asked years later if Barnett was misunderstood, Ole flatly replied, no, he was exactly what he looked like, a manipulator. That wasn't wrestling heat. That was a man burying his boss with a shovel he brought from home. And Barnett never forgave him. And when he eventually helped Vince McMahon orchestrate the WWF's hostile entry into the TBS time slot, Barnett deliberately cut Ole out of every discussion. Revenge, sweet and legal. He let Ole win the company, then burned the building it sat in. That wasn't my boy. That was dead to me. Jim Wilson walked into wrestling from the NFL expecting to play fair. That was his first mistake. His second, saying no to Jim Barnett. According to Wilson's own book, Chokehold, Barnett made an advance while they were touring Australia in 1973, and when Wilson turned him down, his career nosedived faster than a heel off a scaffold. Wilson claimed he was blackballed across every territory Barnett touched, starting in Georgia. One week he was headlining shows, the next, he couldn't get booked for a squash match in Amarillo. His phone stopped ringing. His name became mud. And the worst part? Barnett never denied it. He just smiled and kept moving. According to Wilson, the promoter's response was cold and clear. You'll never work in this business again. And he wasn't lying. But Wilson didn't just take the hit. He fought back, loudly. He co-founded a short-lived wrestlers' union attempt, filed lawsuits, and named names in his book, accusing Barnett of using power and influence to bury those who didn't play by his rules, social, sexual, or otherwise. Whether every claim held up under legal scrutiny didn't matter much backstage. What mattered was that Wilson had gone public. And Barnett hated public. Jim Barnett didn't scream, didn't threaten. He quietly flicked the switch. And Wilson? He spent the rest of his life yelling into a spotlight that had already been shut off. Barnett saw him as disloyal, defiant, and worst of all, no longer useful. In a business where blacklisting was more effective than a pile driver, Wilson got both. And to Barnett, that was justice. The ring was his courtroom, and the sentence was, you're done. Thunderbolt Patterson was loud, proud, and about as likely to stay quiet as he was to job clean for a handshake. In the Georgia territory, he wasn't just a crowd favorite. He was a real threat to the status quo, and Jim Barnett hated that kind of noise. Patterson didn't play backstage politics. He kicked the door open and demanded to know who was getting screwed, who was getting paid, and why guys like him weren't getting either. He was black, vocal, and union-friendly in a system run by old white promoters who thought just be happy to be here was sound HR policy. Barnett wasn't just uncomfortable with Patterson. He saw him as a wrecking ball aimed directly at his nice little empire on WTBS. Patterson alleged that Barnett blackballed him not just for being outspoken, but for trying to organize the locker room. He tried rallying wrestlers to fight for health care, rights, and even a pension system. Barnett's response? Cut the feed. Patterson was quietly benched, future bookings disappeared, and word got around fast. Working with him could cost you work too. That's how Barnett played it. No confrontation, just silence, snubs, and a career suddenly stalled like a car with no gas. The only time Barnett allegedly even acknowledged Patterson's demands, he laughed. Called him a loud problem, not a talent. The truth is, Patterson's biggest heat with Barnett came from being right. The things he said would come to define modern wrestling's systemic problems: lack of health care, no retirement, racial gatekeeping. But in Barnett's world, that made him radioactive. To Patterson, Barnett was the system in a suit. To Barnett, Patterson was a whistle with legs, and he hated that whistle with his whole soul. There's betrayal in wrestling, and then there's what Jack and Jerry Briscoe did to Jim Barnett. These weren't just wrestlers in his locker room. They were partners in Georgia Championship Wrestling, men Barnett trusted enough to give boardroom access and ownership stakes. And when Barnett needed loyalty the most, the Briscoes picked Vince McMahon. By 1983, Barnett was barely holding the territory together. Ole Anderson was trying to push him out, and the NWA system was fraying at the edges. But instead of siding with Barnett to keep GCW independent, the Briscoes started negotiating in secret with Vince, who wanted GCW's prized TBS time slot. The Briscoes had the votes, so they flipped, sold their shares, made the deal behind Barnett's back. And Black Saturday was born, the WWF takeover of Georgia's TV slot, live on Ted Turner's airwaves. Worse? Barnett had helped smooth the transition. Vince used him as a Trojan horse to reassure TBS execs and grease the business side. Barnett thought he was still part of the plan. Until he wasn't. The Briscoes signed, Vince took over, and Barnett was shoved into irrelevance. Jack Briscoe was the real heartbreak. Barnett had backed him in meetings, built him up politically, but Jack chose a payday over a partnership. Barnett reportedly told a confidant years later, "I gave them the kingdom, they gave me the knife." To the Briscoes, it was just business. To Barnett, it was the end of everything. He didn't scream, he didn't rant, he cut them out. Barnett never mentioned them again. Not publicly, not warmly, not once. Because when Jim Barnett hated you, he didn't burn the bridge, he erased the road. In a business full of loudmouths and chair shots, the most dangerous man in the room was the one who never raised his voice. This was a guy who could smile, pour you a drink, and then blacklist you so hard you'd have to wrestle shadows in a bingo hall. The beefs weren't explosive, they were strategic, precise, surgical. If you ended up on his bad side, you didn't just lose a push, you lost your passport to the entire industry. And what made him terrifying wasn't the power, it was how casually he used it. He didn't scream, he didn't threaten, he just picked up the phone and made you disappear. He hated betrayal more than anything, thought loyalty should come with silence, gratitude, and never asking questions. And if you broke that rule, if you challenged the system, aired dirty laundry, or worse, made a deal without him, you were already done. You just didn't know it yet. This wasn't some overhyped locker room tyrant. This was chess. Business chess. And he played to win. So next time someone calls the promoter a harmless suit in the background, remember, suits make the calls, and some of them never forget who owed them. Now, if you want more backstage warfare told straight, hit like, slap that subscribe, and ring the damn bell so you never miss the real heat. No names dropped, just careers. Thanks for watching. Jack Tunney didn't yell. He didn't scream. He didn't throw chairs or cut worked shoot promos in a leather jacket like Eric Bischoff. No, this bastard ruled with a deadpan press release and the smirk of a man who just got you fired without blinking. He was Vince McMahon's Canadian front, part silent partner, part stooge, part ceremonial axe. You pissed off the machine. Tunney was the guy they sent in to make it official. And don't let that calm, stoic voice fool you. The man had enemies, not just wrestlers he suspended or stripped of titles, but guys who legitimately hated his guts. Backstage, Tunney was seen as arrogant, territorial, and old-school crooked. His office in Toronto, protected like a damn fortress. There were rumors of cash skims, sketchy licensing fees, and late payoffs. And when wrestlers went over his head, he never forgot it. The irony? Half the fans thought he was just an actor on TV. The other half thought he was real, but too boring to matter. Meanwhile, in real life, Tunney was ending careers, banning snakes, and getting choked out on national television by a guy who didn't give a fuck about protocol. This ain't a tribute. This is a hit list. 5 guys who saw through the corporate suit, called bullshit on the handshake deals, and found out the hard way that Jack Tunney didn't need to raise his voice to bury your ass. Jack Tunney wasn't some powerless bureaucrat. He was WWF's on-screen president and a key backstage gatekeeper, especially in Canada, where his family's Maple Leaf Wrestling promotion gave him real influence over local shows and talent relations. While WWF was an American company running national and international shows, Tunney acted like the corporate watchdog, controlling who got opportunities and keeping the locker room in line. That's what made Bad News Brown's explosion in 1988 so legendary. On the Brother Love show, Brown publicly called out Tunney for playing favorites with Randy Savage and Miss Elizabeth, accusing him of running the company like a rigged casino. When Tunney poked him in the chest, trying to assert control, Brown snapped. He grabbed Tunney's tie and choked the guy live on national television. This wasn't scripted theater. It was pure shoot heat, a real backstage feud boiling over in front of millions. Brown was so disgusted by the politics and Tunney's obvious favoritism that he quit the WWF shortly after. Brown didn't choke Tunney just to make a point. He was teaching a masterclass in how to handle office politics when the meeting's gone sideways. Brown wanted a shot at the big time, but Tunney made it clear that the only people who mattered were in Savage's inner circle. The choke wasn't just a moment of rage, it was a brutal message to the whole locker room about who really controlled the keys to the kingdom. Rick Rude never played nice with authority. He didn't trust it, didn't kiss its ass, and didn't care if the guy in the suit was holding the pencil or just signing off. So even though Vince McMahon ultimately made the decisions, Jack Tunney, as the front office figurehead, caught a faceful of Rude's venom any time the waters got choppy. Rude reportedly viewed Tunney as a cowardly mouthpiece. One source claiming he called the office a fucking clown palace, and once joked about showing up live on WCW with the Intercontinental belt just to make Tunney shit his pants in Toronto. The tension between them wasn't a loud, screaming match. It was quieter and colder. Rude would no-sell office memos, blow off corporate meetings, and treat Tunney's presidential announcements like spam mail. While McMahon held the power, Tunney was the guy expected to keep order, and Rude made sure that never happened clean. Tunney treated Rude like a bomb disposal job, but instead of cutting the wire, he just handed it back to Vince and clocked out. It wasn't kayfabe. Rude's contempt for the front office was nuclear, and Tunney stood right in the fallout zone. It didn't help that Rude's attitude backstage grew worse after his push plateaued. Tunney was said to have washed his hands of him, wanting nothing to do with the guy off camera. It was classic Tunney. Smile on TV, grit your teeth in private. By 1991, the heat was so bad Tunney reportedly told Patterson he was done defending Rick Rude. When Rude eventually split, it wasn't quiet. It was a middle finger and a plane ticket. By 1992, Jack Tunney was just a polite Canadian prop with a tie. He had the on-screen title of the WWF president, but behind the scenes, he wasn't allowed to order a sandwich without checking with Vince McMahon first. Still, even in that role, Tunney had strong feelings, and one of the people he absolutely hated was Nails. Nails, real name Kevin Washholtz, came in with a gimmick right out of a bad cop show. Former convict, bitter about the big boss man, and ready to growl his way through 6-minute squash matches. But the dude wasn't just playing a psychopath, he was one. He'd been bitching about payoffs backstage for weeks. In December '92, it exploded. Nails barged into Vince's office at a TV taping in Green Bay and grabbed him by the throat, pinning him against the wall. Full-on assault. Vince broke free and had security toss him out. Nails was fired that same night. No severance, no second chances. Vince handled the firing, but Tunney helped kill his reputation. Tunney took to the syndicated shows, acting like he'd suspended Nails. In reality, he was just polishing Vince's boot with Canadian spit. But he hated that it happened on his watch. This wasn't just an angry guy. This was a living, snarling embarrassment to the fake structure Tunney was supposed to represent. The heat never cooled. Nails sued Vince afterward and even accused him of sexual assault. Total insanity. Tunney's response? Radio silence. No statements, no support, no rebuttals. Just quiet, Canadian loathing. Tunney didn't fire Nails, but he buried the motherfucker with TV silence, PR deletions, and cold, bitter contempt. Because even fake presidents have real pride. George Scott was the kind of promoter who thought loyalty came with a ledger. He'd been around the territories long enough to think everyone owed him for just showing up in a blazer. But by the mid-'80s, Jack Tunney was done splitting Maple Leaf Wrestling like it was a church potluck. He cut Scott out like a polyp, quietly, surgically, and permanently. In 1981, the Scott brothers, George and Angus, bought into Frank Tunney's Toronto territory, snagging themselves a 1/3 stake. For a while, it was the politest little Cold War in Canadian wrestling. The deal was with Frank, who'd raised his nephew Jack Tunney like a son after Jack's father died young. But when Frank passed in 1983, Jack inherited the rest, and the Scotts made mistake number one, thinking they were equal partners. When Jack jumped ship in 1984, siding exclusively with the WWF, George got ghosted harder than a Tinder date with a mullet. No call, no warning. Jack just walked into the Toronto office, changed the locks, and booked Hulk Hogan at Maple Leaf Gardens. Scott lost the promotion and his mind. He sued. Jack didn't flinch. Even after George won a $500,000 payout, plus $150,000 in legal fees around 1992, Tunney never once addressed it publicly. Not once. That's how much Jack respected him. He wouldn't even use his name in a losing lawsuit. George said later Jack had betrayed him. But let's get real. Jack didn't betray George. He just finally cashed the receipt. Wrestling was changing. Jack evolved. George sued. Scott thought he was a visionary. Jack thought he was deadweight. Only one of them walked into WrestleMania weekend with Vince's limo keys. Jack Tunney is the wrestling office guy everyone loved to hate. And that's being generous. He wasn't Vince McMahon, he wasn't the creative genius, and he definitely wasn't the boss behind the curtain. But he played the role perfectly. The polite, buttoned-up suit standing between chaos and order in the WWF's early 90s golden era. Before the WWF takeover, Tunney was the guy running the Toronto wrestling scene like a small-time mafia don, keeping the peace, cutting deals, and occasionally telling the bigger dogs to piss off. He wasn't a wrestler, but he held power in the pockets of promoters and talent alike, making or breaking careers with a phone call or a cold shoulder. But here's the catch. Tunney was no saint. He was a man who protected the company's interests ruthlessly, especially when it came to controlling loose cannons like Bad News Brown, Nails, and even Jake Roberts when push came to shove. And when push came to shove, Tunney sided with the suits and the money, burying anyone who threatened the status quo. After 1995, when Vince officially took the reins and Tunney faded off TV for good, he lived quietly away from the spotlight. The real power players moving on while Tunney became a footnote. He passed in 2004, a man who never grabbed the mic but held the reins tightly enough to shape wrestling's corporate evolution. If you're going to remember Tunney, remember this. He was the gatekeeper of a changing era, a polite suit who hated the chaos but couldn't stop it from bleeding through anyway. He wasn't the villain, but he sure wasn't the hero either. Like and subscribe to keep tearing down wrestling's polished facade, exposing the dirty business and real grudges behind the curtain. Thanks for watching. If wrestling had a hall of fame for backstage headaches, Ole Anderson would be its founding member. The man wasn't just difficult. He was a living, breathing complication who made promoters want to tear their hair out, and wrestlers wonder if the chair they just caught was coming back to collect. While some wrestlers earned heat in the ring, Ole earned it behind the curtain, and he wasn't shy about making enemies, both with talent and management. Known for stiff matches that felt more like brawls and political moves that could crush a rhino, Ole didn't just ruffle feathers. He plucked out the whole damn wing. If you wanted calm locker rooms, you kept your distance, but if chaos was your game, Ole was the MVP. His reputation for stirring the pot was so intense, even the toughest vets tread lightly around him. He had a knack for turning small disagreements into full-blown backstage wars, leaving a trail of bruised egos and broken alliances wherever he went. This video digs into 5 real backstage grudges that made Anderson a legend for all the wrong reasons, showcasing how his reputation for trouble still echoes in wrestling's corridors today. If Ole Anderson's middle name wasn't Trouble, it should have been Brick. The man didn't just throw chairs, he launched them like they owed him money. One infamous incident saw him take out a fellow wrestler with such ferocity that locker room whispers turned into outright war cries. The victim? A young up-and-comer who asked for a polite change in the match finish. Instead of a simple no, Anderson decided to demonstrate how the business was run, with a steel chair to the back that echoed louder than the crowd's cheers. That's not just sending a message. That's writing a whole damn novel in bruises. Wrestlers learned quickly. Crossing Ole was like shaking hands with a rattlesnake. Sure, it looks polite, but you're probably going to lose a finger. His chair shots became legendary, the kind of punishment that turned friends into sworn enemies overnight. There's a reason people whispered that Anderson was the guy you wanted on your side until you weren't. Behind the scenes, he was less a teammate and more a walking threat. If you wanted calm, steer clear. If you wanted drama, he was the storm. This video digs into the real backstage wars that cemented Ole Anderson's reputation as one of wrestling's most feared and divisive figures, showing how his trail of chaos still echoes through the business today. Ole Anderson didn't just argue over who got the spotlight. He fought like the last slice of pizza was on the line. Known for his political maneuvering, Anderson was a master at turning booking meetings into blood sports. Promoters dreaded scheduling matches with him because Ole played the system like a cheat code. Want a fair shake? Too bad. Anderson twisted the knife, making sure he got the best spots, while everyone else got leftovers. You haven't seen a power trip until you've watched a man argue about where he fits in the card for hours, while everyone else slowly died inside. One promoter reportedly said dealing with Anderson was like negotiating with a grizzly bear who just stubbed his toe. Unpredictable and prone to snapping at anyone nearby. That toe stubbing probably explains why the bear showed up late to meetings just to catch folks off guard. Anderson's political warfare wasn't just about ego, it was a survival tactic. In a business where your spot could make or break your career, Anderson made sure his career was bulletproof, even if it meant stepping on a few necks on the way. If you weren't careful, Ole didn't just elbow you out of the way, he set the whole ring on fire, a promoter once said. For those stuck in his crosshairs, backstage life wasn't a wrestling match, it was a slow, brutal cage fight. Ole Anderson wasn't just a bully with a chair. He was the guy who turned every match into a lesson in pain. Known for his stiff style, wrestlers stepping into the ring with him didn't just prepare for choreography, they braced for punishment. Anderson's moves were less dance and more dent. Multiple locker room stories describe Anderson's refusal to cooperate during matches, deliberately stiffening strikes and holds to assert dominance or settle scores. It wasn't about performance, it was about sending a message. You respect me or you get hurt. That message left more than bruises. It broke friendships and careers. Wrestlers learned fast. Going soft with Anderson meant risking being seen as weak. Going hard meant a real shot back. His stiff approach caused lingering resentment, making him one of the most feared men to share a locker room with. I went in for a friendly match and came out questioning my career choices, one veteran recalled dryly. Promoters often worried about Anderson's style because real injuries meant lost dates and angry fans. But for Anderson, it was less about business and more about respect, earned the hard way. In a world where performance matters, Anderson made sure his reputation was built on pain, and not the scripted kind. Ole Anderson's feud wasn't just with wrestlers, it was with management too, and those battles got downright vicious. Known for refusing to toe the company line, Anderson was the guy who made promoters sweat bullets long before a single bell rang. One story has Anderson flat out challenging a top promoter's authority in front of a packed locker room, turning a routine meeting into a full-scale rebellion. When told to play nice and fall in line, he reportedly snapped, "I'm not here to make friends, I'm here to get paid and fight." That moment wasn't just insubordination, it was a declaration of war. Management quickly learned that trying to control Anderson was like wrestling a bear, if the bear could talk trash and hold grudges for decades. His defiance inspired some wrestlers, but terrified others who knew crossing him meant more than a backstage scolding. It meant career-threatening consequences. Anderson's reputation as a troublemaker wasn't just talk. It was a living, breathing nightmare for management teams. You don't tell Ole what to do. You survive him. In a business built on fragile alliances, Anderson was the grenade tossed into the mix. Never subtle, always lethal. Ole Anderson wasn't content to just stir the pot. He wanted to own the kitchen. In the golden age of wrestling territories, Anderson ran his patch like a dictator who hadn't heard the word compromise. He demanded control over bookings, talent, and even catering menus, because why not? His need for dominance sparked turf wars that spread faster than a locker room flu. Promoters from neighboring territories hated having to negotiate with a guy who treated every conversation like a hostage situation. Wrestlers got caught in the crossfire, forced to pick sides in battles that had nothing to do with their matches, but everything to do with Ole's iron grip. One wrestler reportedly summed it up perfectly. Working in Ole's territory was like walking a tightrope over a pit of vipers, and Ole was the biggest snake. The grudges born from these turf wars weren't just professional, they were personal. Friends turned into sworn enemies, alliances shattered like glass, and backstage politics turned poisonous. Anderson's legacy? A locker room still whispering about the chaos he left behind. You didn't cross Ole unless you wanted your career to come with a warning label. Love him or hate him, Anderson's backstage reign was a masterclass in making enemies, and he played it to perfection. Ole Anderson wasn't just a wrestler. He was a walking warning label. His reputation for turning locker rooms into war zones wasn't accidental. It was a career-long habit. The man didn't just ruffle feathers. He plucked out entire wings and handed the scraps to anyone unfortunate enough to cross him. The problems with Anderson weren't just about his stiff style or his love of throwing chairs. They were about his attitude. He treated the business like it was a personal kingdom and everyone else were mere peasants lucky to share his space. Whether it was bullying younger talent, locking horns with promoters, or manipulating bookings, Anderson had a knack for turning every situation into a powder keg. You want a peaceful locker room? Don't invite Ole. Want drama, chaos, and enough grudges to fuel a dozen careers? He was your guy. His style didn't just break bones, it broke trust. And in wrestling, trust is currency more valuable than any title belt. Many wrestlers who worked with him ended up questioning their life choices, while promoters learned quickly that managing Anderson was like trying to nail Jell-O to a wall. Frustrating, messy, and probably impossible. Love him or hate him, Anderson's legacy is a brutal lesson in how one man's ego can poison an entire industry. Wrestling thrived despite him, not because of him. But you can't deny the mark he left, a mark made of bruises, broken friendships, and backstage chaos. If there's one thing you take away from Ole Anderson's story, it's this. Sometimes the toughest battles happen off camera, and Anderson was undefeated in those. If you enjoyed this brutal backstage breakdown, don't just sit there, hit like, subscribe, and ring that bell so you never miss the real stories no one else dares to tell. Trust me, the wrestling world's darker corners need shining lights like this. Stick around, because next time we're diving even deeper into the kind of heat that makes legends and ruins careers. Dory Funk Jr. looked like he taught history at a school for people who flunked recess. Quiet, methodical, polite to a fault, and behind the scenes, an icy grudge holder with the emotional range of a fax machine. If Terry was a beer-swigging lunatic with cowboy boots and rabies, Dory was a trench-digging technician who let his bitterness age like whiskey or curdled milk, depending on who you ask. He wasn't just a champion. He was the NWA champion for 4.5 long years because he refused to drop the belt on time. In a business full of egos, Dory didn't yell. He simmered. And if you crossed him, you didn't get a receipt. You got blackballed. This ain't a fluff piece. This is about one man he genuinely hated. Not, I'll get my heat back, hate. Actual throw hands, call the cops hate. And while his hit list ain't long, the one grudge that made the cut is brutal, bizarre, and buried under decades of phony handshakes. Let's talk about Dory Funk Jr., the most dangerous substitute teacher in wrestling history. Dory Funk Jr. didn't yell, didn't curse, didn't flip tables, but he never forgot a slight. Calm, soft-spoken, and always with that stiff little cowboy gait, he wasn't the kind of guy who'd cut you down in public. He'd just wait till you were out of bookings. He was the NWA's golden child in the early 70s, polite, technical, political. The kind of guy who made headlocks look noble. But behind the scenes, Dory was pure power dresser in a wrestling singlet. He played quiet politics better than half the NWA boardroom. His biggest headline? In 1973, he was supposed to drop the NWA World title to Jack Briscoe. Didn't happen. He claimed he was hurt in a truck accident. The match was canceled, and Briscoe never believed it for a second. And that's the crack in the armor. See, Dory had respect for Briscoe in the ring. He even called him the most enjoyable opponent he ever had. And that was probably true. Technically, they were flawless together. But that didn't stop him, or his father, from possibly stalling a title switch to protect the family's legacy. That's Dory in a nutshell. Calm up front, calculating underneath. He didn't blow up in locker rooms. He worked the phones. He moved chess pieces. And if you ever tried to leapfrog the Funk name, you'd feel it. Slowly, silently, and permanently. He wasn't flashy. He was dangerous. Dory Funk Jr. was supposed to drop the NWA World Heavyweight Championship to Jack Briscoe in 1973. The plan was simple. Briscoe takes the belt, steps into the spotlight, and the NWA moves on. Except Dory pulled a no-show with a tractor accident excuse that's as believable as a politician's promise. A tractor accident? Really? This sounds less like a wrestling injury and more like the kind of nonsense that comes from someone who's allergic to losing. Jack Briscoe never bought it for a second. Ready to grab the crown, he instead got blindsided by what he believed was a stall tactic cooked up by Dory Jr. and his father. They were protecting the Funk family reign like it was a precious family heirloom, leaving Briscoe feeling like the unwanted cousin left waiting outside the party. Imagine gearing up to take your shot only to have the champ ghost you because he supposedly hurt himself wrestling farm equipment. It's the wrestling equivalent of your Uber driver canceling 5 minutes before pickup because he forgot where you lived. Dory always called Briscoe the most enjoyable opponent he ever had in the ring, and that was probably true. Their chemistry was undeniable, producing classic matches that fans still talk about. But backstage, it was cold as a morgue freezer. Respect in the ring did not mean trust behind the scenes. This wasn't just a missed match, it was classic wrestling politics played cold and calculated. Dory wasn't the hothead who lost his temper. He was the cold strategist moving pawns on a chessboard. Briscoe? He was the knight sacrificed in the game. The fallout shattered trust, stirred locker room gossip, and left promoters scrambling to fix a mess that stunk worse than a barn after a rodeo. So let it be crystal clear. This is Dory Funk Jr.'s take, not mine, and it's as bitter and raw as a Texas sunset burning through your soul. After the whole tractor accident stunt, you'd think these two legends would patch things up over a beer or a handshake. Nope, not in this case. The relationship between Dory Funk Jr. and Jack Briscoe stayed frosty. Icy enough to freeze over a Texas summer, they kept their distance, avoided each other at shows, and exchanged all the warmth of two cacti stuck in a blizzard. Neither ever publicly addressed the grudge in detail. No reality TV reconciliations, no kumbayas. Instead, the resentment simmered quietly like a slow leak in the NWA's political plumbing. Promoters were stuck walking on eggshells, trying to book shows without turning it into a wrestling remake of Game of Thrones. The tension didn't just poison the locker room, it sent shockwaves through the NWA's fragile power structure. Fans might have seen them work matches years later, but backstage, it was all business and cold shoulders. Dory Funk Jr. wasn't a guy who threw punches or screamed in hallways. He was the kind of guy who held grudges like a miser guards his last dollar, silently, methodically, and without mercy. Jack Briscoe learned firsthand that in wrestling, the battle isn't always in the ring. Sometimes it's in the politics, the broken promises, and the grudges you carry long after the crowd has gone home. So here's the deal. Dory Funk Jr., the quiet killer, didn't waste time making enemies. He only hated one man in his entire career, and he learned the hard way that crossing him was a bad idea. No fluff, no drama, just one grudge held tighter than a sleeper hold. If you thought wrestling was about flash and fireworks, think again. The real heat was cold, calculated, and deadly silent. Dory wasn't some loudmouth throwing fits. He was the guy who waited patiently, letting his enemies drown in their own mistakes while he planned the slow, sure choke. So if you ever cross a legend like Funk, don't expect fireworks. Expect a long, cold burn that leaves scars nobody else sees. If you dug this deep dive into grudges that mattered, hit like, punch subscribe, and ring that bell like it owes you money. More savage truths coming your way. Stay tuned and stay ruthless. Thanks for watching. Jeff Jarrett, the chosen one. The self-anointed king of the mid-card who somehow convinced entire promotions to crown him world champion. And in the process, he racked up enemies like he was collecting guitars to smash. Now, this isn't about fans booing because the storyline said so. This is about wrestlers, promoters, and executives who genuinely couldn't stand the man. We're talking refusals to work with him, money disputes that ended careers, racial accusations, family grudges, and even creative allies turning into lifelong enemies. Jarrett was the guy who always seemed to be in the right place at the wrong time, with the wrong attitude. When wrestlers openly questioned his toughness, when promoters went on live TV to humiliate him, and when executives nearly wanted to fight, you're not hated for your heel act. You're hated because people are tired of your politics and your booking. So let's dive in. Here are some of the people who hated Jeff Jarrett, and why they'll never forgive him, no matter what excuses he tried throwing around backstage politics, because grudges in wrestling age worse than Jarrett's endless guitar-swinging entrances. Ahmed Johnson entered the WWE as a powerhouse with one of the most intimidating physiques of the 90s, and he wasn't here to make friends. But when he locked eyes with Jeff Jarrett backstage, things went nuclear. Johnson openly accused Jarrett of being racist and refusing to put others over, and according to multiple sources, the tension wasn't kayfabe, it was real-life venom. Johnson's beef with Jarrett started over a feud where Jarrett allegedly tried to control the narrative, manipulate outcomes, and protect his own spot at all costs. Johnson saw through it immediately. He refused to be the backdrop for Jarrett's ego, claiming that the guy made every match about himself and had a habit of undermining talent. Reports indicate Johnson would coldly glare at him during promos and matches, letting the heat simmer in the locker room like a kettle about to explode. The tension leaked to the audience too. Johnson's matches against Jarrett carried an undercurrent of distrust. When Johnson slammed Jarrett with a full-power clothesline, it felt like it could be a legitimate message instead of choreography. That intensity earned him respect from some colleagues, but Jarrett? He doubled down on backstage politics, which only fueled Johnson's hate. Johnson treated Jarrett like a human speed bump, ugly, loud, and impossible to ignore. By the time the feud ended, Johnson wasn't just frustrated, he was seething. Jarrett's reputation as a self-serving, controlling performer made him one of the few people in the 90s locker room that Johnson genuinely loathed. This wasn't storyline tension. This was pure backstage heat, personal and enduring. Shane McMahon's hatred for Jeff Jarrett didn't happen in a storyline, it happened in real life. In 1999, Jarrett allegedly demanded a six-figure payday before dropping the Intercontinental title to a top performer, forcing management to intervene. Shane saw this as a personal betrayal. Backstage whispers claim he nearly lost his temper physically. Jarrett's ego and obsession with controlling outcomes made him a lightning rod for tension, and Shane wasn't about to let it slide. Reports indicate Shane would confront Jarrett during hallways and production meetings, making it clear he knew every manipulative move. Jarrett's behavior, protecting his spot, refusing to put over younger talent, and bending booking decisions to his advantage, turned even allies into enemies overnight. The locker room became a minefield whenever Jarrett was present, and Shane made it obvious that his patience had limits. Jarrett's presence backstage was like a storm cloud. Every conversation, every scheduling decision, every minor oversight became a flashpoint. Shane reportedly would glare him down, making it obvious that he saw through every calculated move. Other staff and talent knew Shane's patience had limits, and Jarrett's repeated attempts to manipulate outcomes only deepened the animosity. Shane treated Jarrett like a glitching software program, impossible to trust, frustrating to deal with, and inevitably destined to crash. By the end of their professional overlap, it wasn't just irritation anymore, it was full-on contempt. The tension was entirely off-camera, purely backstage, and completely real. Anyone watching from the outside would never have guessed the amount of venom this one-sided hatred carried. Steve Austin's hatred for Jeff Jarrett was not scripted. It was entirely real. Austin openly refused to work with Jarrett at certain points in the WWE, citing his lack of physical credibility and manipulative behavior. Sources indicate that Austin viewed Jarrett as someone who constantly tried to control matches and protect himself at the expense of other performers. In Austin's eyes, that made Jarrett more dangerous backstage than in the ring. Backstage, the tension was palpable. Austin would reportedly glare at Jarrett during meetings and even casual conversations, making it clear he had no respect for his ego-driven antics. Other wrestlers noticed the friction. Jarrett's constant politicking and demands for preferential treatment made Austin question his reliability. The result was a standoff where nobody wanted to share a locker room with him, especially Austin. Jarrett's behavior didn't just annoy Austin, it created ripples throughout the locker room. Wrestlers felt forced to navigate around his backstage manipulations, while Austin would openly call him out for it. Jarrett's obsession with self-preservation and booking control made him a lightning rod for criticism, and Austin never held back. Austin treated Jarrett like a broken beer bottle, sharp, dangerous, and bound to leave a mark on anyone who got too close. By the time their paths crossed in any professional context, Jarrett wasn't just disliked, he was actively hated by one of the locker room's most feared figures. This wasn't storyline heat. It was real, personal, and enduring, a grudge that left a permanent backstage scar. Jeff Jarrett and the chairman's relationship was far from friendly. Sources confirm that backstage, Jarrett frequently pushed boundaries, trying to influence booking and secure preferential treatment. The chairman reportedly grew frustrated with Jarrett's constant politicking, seeing him as a persistent thorn in the side of management. Jarrett's self-interest clashed with the chairman's authority repeatedly. He was known to challenge decisions, complain about match placements, and maneuver for advantages, creating a tense atmosphere in the office. Management viewed him as someone who was never satisfied, always angling for personal gain. The chairman's disdain was reportedly rooted in this relentless ego and Jarrett's unwillingness to defer to company direction. Several backstage confrontations were reported, where Jarrett's actions directly tested the patience of management. He would argue over creative choices, sometimes in the presence of other talent, forcing the chairman to intervene. These incidents were not kayfabe. They were raw, personal clashes that highlighted Jarrett's reputation for stirring tension. Jarrett's maneuvering backstage earned him a label as difficult and untrustworthy. The chairman's reaction was consistent: minimize Jarrett's influence whenever possible, enforce boundaries, and keep a close eye on his activities. Even when Jarrett tried to smooth over conflicts, the animosity lingered, leaving a lasting impression on office culture. Jarrett had a way of making himself indispensable while simultaneously testing patience, a combination that left management exasperated. His political games ensured that backstage, he wasn't just disliked, he was actively resented. For anyone observing, the tension was tangible, and the grudges were real, making it clear that some people in power were never going to forgive him. Jeff Jarrett and Russo were friends, but that didn't make backstage politics any less brutal. If anything, it made it worse. Friends don't let friends take the easy route, and Jarrett loved making Russo's life complicated. Meetings that should have been about storylines often felt like an emotional roller coaster, with more eye rolls than actual plotting. Jarrett had a habit of helping with scripts. Russo would pitch an idea, Jarrett would tweak it, and suddenly the room was debating logic like philosophers on Red Bull. It wasn't personal, it was Jarrett being Jarrett. Russo once admitted that arguing with him felt like wrestling with a velvet-covered bear, soft on the outside, relentless on the inside. Even as friends, Jarrett could push buttons. Russo would suggest a storyline, Jarrett would push back, and everyone else was just holding popcorn. One source recalled Russo muttering, "If I wanted this much ego in my life, I'd adopt a peacock," after a particularly Jarrett-esque rewrite. It was playful torture, friendship edition. The beauty was that even when they fought, they respected each other's brains. Jarrett could steal the spotlight in a room full of writers, but Russo still laughed, rolled his eyes, and carried on. Their friendship survived the chaos because underneath all the ego and backstage maneuvers, they both loved wrestling, and they both knew exactly who could out-argue who. Jeff Jarrett and Russo didn't just clash, they turned friendly debates into legendary backstage stories. For Russo, every encounter was a reminder. Friendship with Jarrett meant never a dull moment, always a headache, and occasionally, a story worth telling. Even though Russo clashed with Jarrett's ego and booking politics, he never stopped respecting his friend. They fought, argued, and threw verbal punches, but Russo always acknowledged Jarrett's dedication, creativity, and influence in wrestling. Their friendship survived the heat, showing that hate and respect can coexist backstage. Jeff Jarrett leaves a trail of grudges like confetti at a chaotic office party. From furious tempers to flying fists, simmering resentment, and clashing egos, he collected enemies faster than a championship belt changes hands. Even friends turned wary in his orbit. He made egos clash, tempers flare, and backstage politics a spectator sport. Jarrett wasn't just hated, he was unavoidable, a human lightning rod for frustration, envy, and pure irritation. By the time he walked out of any arena, someone was plotting, muttering, or plotting mutters. If there's a lesson in all this hate, it's simple. Be like Jeff, but maybe skip the backstage chaos, or don't, because nothing makes wrestling more entertaining than someone collecting grudges like trophies. Don't forget to like this video and hit subscribe. Don't forget, if you ever think your job is stressful, remember, Jeff Jarrett made dozens of legends genuinely loathe him, and somehow survived it all. Thanks for watching. Vince McMahon isn't just a billionaire wrestling promoter, he's a walking grudge with quads. A man who built an empire, destroyed territories, and once told Bob Costas to his face, "I'm your daddy now." You don't get to be the king of sports entertainment without stepping on some throats. But there are a select few Vince didn't just step on. He danced on their reputations, pissed on their legacy, and if he could have, fired them from life itself. And that's the thing with Vince. Hatred was never casual. You had to earn it. You had to really piss off the man who once turned his own daughter's wedding into a storyline. Whether it was union talk, ego power plays, public trashing of the company, or straight-up lawsuits, these five guys made Vince see redder than Raw's logo. Some of them he eventually forgave. Others? He probably still mutters their names like curses into his protein shakes. So let's count down the 5 wrestlers who made Vince McMahon's shit list permanent. The ones he turned into punchlines, ghosts, or propaganda films. They didn't just cross the boss, and they got steamrolled by him. Buckle in, it's going to get stiff. Bruno Sammartino didn't just hate Vince McMahon, he loathed everything the man stood for. To Bruno, Vince was the Antichrist in a three-piece suit, corrupting the sacred sport of wrestling with steroids, sex, and gimmicks dumber than a bag of doorknobs. And Vince? Vince saw Bruno as a relic with a superiority complex and a microphone. Their relationship was basically Rocky versus corporate America, if Rocky had a thicker accent and way more judgment. Bruno wasn't quiet either. The man buried Vince in interviews like he was cutting a decade-long shoot promo. Every time someone stuck a mic in his face, it was, "Wrestling's gone to hell, and Vince is the devil." He sounded like he was trying to unionize heaven. Vince responded the only way he knew how: blacklisting. Bruno vanished from WWF history. Vince couldn't stand how Bruno made him look like a sleazy carnival barker to mainstream audiences. And Bruno? He was disgusted by the drug use, the nudity, and the fact that Hulk Hogan had the charisma of a sweaty hot dog yet made millions. So how bad was the beef? For 25 years, Bruno refused to step foot in WWE. He didn't come back for the money, didn't come back for nostalgia. He only came back in 2013 after Triple H personally begged him. Even then, Bruno made it clear. He still didn't like Vince. He just appreciated that someone else in the family had manners and biceps. Reconciliation status? Technically, yes. But Vince didn't induct him, and Bruno never thanked him. It was more Cold War armistice than reunion. In Vince's mind, Bruno's legacy was always stained with sanctimony. And in Bruno's mind, Vince was a liar with a limo. Mutual respect? Nah, just mutual tolerance, at best. If there was one wrestler Vince McMahon wished would have just shut the hell up and posed, it was Jesse Ventura, the walking, talking anti-corporate migraine in feather boas. Jesse wasn't just a problem because he had a voice. He was a problem because he used it, loudly and legally. Let's rewind to 1986. Jesse starts whispering the dreaded U word in the locker room: union. To Vince, that word was like garlic to a vampire. Jesse wanted the boys to get benefits, retirement, maybe a dental plan. Vince wanted them to get back in the ring and shut up about it. Hulk Hogan, in full stooge mode, snitched to Vince, and just like that, Jesse's dreams of a wrestling union were body slammed into oblivion. But Jesse wasn't done. In 1991, he sued Vince over unpaid royalties from videotape sales. Most guys would have backed down. Jesse lawyered up and won. In Vince's mind, that wasn't just betrayal, that was a personal attack. You don't beat Vince in court, that's like beating God in arm wrestling. And then Jesse really made it worse. He got famous without Vince, governor of Minnesota, Hollywood actor, conspiracy nut with a fan base. The guy became a walking reminder that you can leave Vince and still thrive, which, in Vince's book, is blasphemy. Vince's revenge, erasure. Jesse's commentary was scrubbed from home videos. WWE pretended like Gorilla Monsoon was talking to himself for half of WrestleMania. Ventura went from iconic voice to Invisible Man faster than you can say no health insurance. Did they reconcile? Kinda. Jesse made a few appearances in the late 2000s, even hosted Raw once. But every time he showed up, Vince looked like he was sucking lemons behind the curtain. There was no hug, no love, just two old egos sharing airtime for a paycheck. To Vince, Jesse wasn't just a thorn in his side. He was a thorn with a lawyer, a podium, and a grudge. And worst of all, he made Vince feel vulnerable. That's the kind of hate that lingers. The Ultimate Warrior wasn't just a Vince McMahon creation. He was a protein shake-fueled fever dream. Vince loved him at first. He was everything Vince thought a top guy should be. Big, intense, jacked to oblivion, and yelling nonsense like a roid-raging motivational speaker. But Warrior didn't stay Vince's golden boy for long, because Warrior figured out something dangerous. Vince needed him. And so, in 1991, right before SummerSlam, Warrior did what every wrestler in Vince's nightmares does. He sent a letter demanding more money, or he wouldn't go to the ring. He held Vince up like it was a backstage robbery. Vince paid him that night to avoid chaos, then fired him right after. The man didn't even make it to catering before being told to hit the bricks. But Warrior came back. Twice. Each return more bizarre and brief than the last. He no-showed events. He trashed the company in bizarre blog posts where he sounded like Ayn Rand on meth. Vince finally snapped and commissioned a DVD titled The Self-Destruction of the Ultimate Warrior, which was basically 90 minutes of WWE employees dunking on him like it was a Comedy Central roast. Vince had never buried someone that hard publicly. Not even Brett. This was personal. Warrior had disrespected the business, the locker room, and, most unforgivably, Vince's control. But in 2014, in a move that shocked everyone, Warrior was inducted into the Hall of Fame. Vince even hugged him, probably the most physically painful thing either of them ever did. Warrior died 2 days later, literally hours after cutting a promo about death on Raw. It was so surreal you'd think Vince wrote it. Did they reconcile? Yes, sort of. Warrior got his Hall of Fame moment, and Vince let bygones be bygones just in time for the merchandising checks to clear. But don't get it twisted. He just filed it under Do Not Trust. To Vince, Warrior wasn't a legend. He was a cautionary tale in face paint, and Vince made damn sure the whole world knew it. If there's one name that makes Vince McMahon's jaw clench like he's chewing broken glass, it's Bret Hart. The Hitman wasn't just a top guy, he was Vince's hand-picked face of the company. But by 1997, Bret had become the wrestling equivalent of your dad, who won't stop talking about how things were better before cell phones and Stone Cold. Now, Bret had a 20-year loyalty streak, but Vince had something stronger, a contract problem. So Vince tells Bret, "Sorry, pal, I can't pay you what I promised. Why don't you go to WCW?" Bret agrees, but wants to drop the title after Survivor Series? Not at Survivor Series, and definitely not in Canada. That's when Vince pulled out the betrayal playbook and screwed Bret on live TV. One of the greatest heel turns of all time, and it wasn't even scripted. Earl Hebner rang the bell, Shawn Michaels grabbed the belt, and Vince sprinted out of the arena like he owed money to the mob. Backstage? Bret punched Vince in the face so hard he sprained his hand. Vince showed up on Raw with a black eye and birthed the Mr. McMahon character out of pure spite and swelling. Bret screwed Bret, he said, and that was it. Bret was erased. Legacy? Gone. Name? Banned. You'd have better luck finding Osama bin Laden on a WWF program in '98 than seeing the Hitman. It took 13 years and a stroke for Vince to even consider letting Bret back. 2010, and Bret looked like a man reconciling with his ex-wife purely because the grandkids were watching. Did they reconcile? Technically, yes. But it was more of a political handshake than a healing moment. Vince got closure. Bret got merch. But make no mistake, for over a decade, Bret Hart was Vince's walking, talking betrayal, wearing pink and black and ruining his day. Vince didn't just hate how it ended. He hated that Bret made him look weak, and that's the sin he never forgets. CM Punk was everything Vince McMahon claims to love. Charismatic, controversial, and capable of selling out arenas while flipping off authority. The problem? Punk was the first guy to cut a promo on Vince and mean every damn word of it. And he did it live on Raw with that now legendary pipe bomb promo, the corporate equivalent of taking a dump on the boardroom table and daring someone to pick it up. At first, Vince was into it. Punk was red hot, moving merch, and dragging eyeballs back to the product like it was 1998. But Punk was never just a character. He was a true believer with a martyr complex and a list of grudges longer than a Brock Lesnar contract. He hated the part-timers, the politics, and yes, Vince himself. And behind the scenes, it was chaos. Punk clashed with creative, trashed medical staff and told Vince's yes men where to stick their ideas. He felt unheard, overworked, and underpaid. So in 2014, he walked. Not a storyline, no fake retirement, just gone. He ghosted WWE like it owed him money, which it did. And then came the podcast. 2 hours of CM Punk absolutely crucifying Vince, Triple H, and WWE's entire medical team. It was part shoot, part therapy, and 100% a PR nightmare. Punk accused them of negligence, claimed he was forced to wrestle injured, and dropped truth bombs like he was trying to burn Titan Tower to the ground. Vince's response: "I apologize. If he was misdiagnosed." Translation: lawyers are watching. Punk sued the doctor. The doctor sued back. It was like watching a Thanksgiving dinner explode into a court case. Did they reconcile? Barely. Punk returned after Vince was no longer calling the shots creatively. Translation: Punk came back the moment Vince wasn't the boss anymore, and even then, it was clear, if Vince had still been in charge, there's no way in hell Punk would have walked through Gorilla. To Vince, CM Punk was the ungrateful punk rocker who dared to speak truth to power. And worst of all, people listened. So there you have it. Vince McMahon's Mount Rushmore of regret, chiseled not in stone, but in pure, uncut contempt. 5 men who didn't just defy him, they haunted him. Not in the kayfabe sense. No, these were the guys who made Vince McMahon stare into the mirror at 4 a.m. and mutter, "Maybe I can't control everything?" right before screaming at a houseplant. Now, before someone with a Funko Pop addiction slides into the comments with, actually, Mount Rushmore only has 4 heads. Yeah, we know. But this is Vince McMahon's Mount Rushmore, and of course, the lunatic added a 5th face. Because why follow tradition when you can scream at it and then fire it over facts? Picture it. Jesse Ventura, the Ultimate Warrior, Bret Hart, CM Punk, and Bruno Sammartino's big Italian granite dome crammed onto the side like someone glued a bocce ball to a national monument. It's over budget, off-center, and structurally unsafe, just like the XFL. But hey, it makes sense. Vince never stopped at 4 when there were 5 lawsuits on his desk. Jesse tried to unionize the boys. Vince erased him from history like a teenage ex on Instagram. Warrior held him hostage for cash, then spent his retirement ranting like a possessed gym teacher. Bret clocked him in the mouth and spent 10 years reliving it like it was WrestleMania 12. Punk tore into him on live TV and then sued his doctor into oblivion. And Bruno? Bruno didn't reconcile. He outlived the bullshit. He didn't just judge Vince. He damned him like an old school priest with a steel chair. These weren't storylines. These were scars. But deep down, Vince probably loved it. The heat, the grudges, the hate. That's how he knew he was still the boss. So if you enjoyed this trip through broken trust and billionaire vendettas, subscribe. Smash that button like it owes you a WrestleMania payday and stick around for more real-life locker room heat. No kayfabe, no filters, just pure shoot fire. Jim Cornette hates bullshit, which is unfortunate, because pro wrestling has more bullshit per square inch than a barn in August. Cornette is like if your cranky uncle got hit in the head with a Mid-South turnbuckle and woke up furious at everyone who ever wore pleather. The man lives on spite. It's his cardio. Jim Cornette is what happens when pure wrestling genius mates with pure, unfiltered rage. He's like if Yelp reviews could get physically violent. The man has so much hate inside him, I'm amazed he hasn't exploded like a crockpot left on overnight. Cornette doesn't just hate bad wrestling. He hates the people who made it possible. Like their existence is a personal insult to his childhood. This isn't I disagree hate. This is I hope your kids flunk out of life just for inheriting your wrestling opinions, and every time you sneeze, it triggers a PTSD flashback of kind of hate. Jim Cornette hated Kevin Steen like he owed him money, ate his dog, and called Memphis wrestling mid in the same sentence. Steen, now known as Kevin Owens in WWE, represented everything Cornette loathes. Fat guys doing moonsaults, indie darlings with beards instead of charisma, and worst of all, getting over without Cornette's approval. Cornette thought Steen looked like a guy who installs cable in your crawlspace and then asks for a sandwich. He once called him an unathletic slob who thinks popping the crowd is the same thing as drawing money. Their Ring of Honor fallout was volcanic. Cornette wanted traditional wrestling storytelling. Steen wanted to scream, bleed, and hit package piledrivers like a psychotic Canadian toddler with sugar rage. Fans loved it. Cornette fucking hated it. At one point, Cornette legit told ROH brass, "It's him or me." Guess who packed his tennis racket and rage quit? Cornette later described Steen as someone who was a bad influence on the locker room and a guy who thinks being disgusting and dangerous is a gimmick. He didn't just dislike the work, he despised the guy. Said he had no work ethic, no respect, and no clue how to draw a dime. But hey, Steen made it to WWE, and Jim Cornette still can't watch Raw without rage pissing himself into a coma, so who really won? Jim Cornette didn't just hate Joey Ryan, he wanted him erased from the business with fire. If Kevin Steen pissed him off, Joey Ryan made Cornette want to file a restraining order against California. The man wrestled with his dick, and Cornette reacted like someone had pissed on the Declaration of Wrestling. Cornette called Joey Ryan a fucking embarrassment to the industry. And that was before the sexual assault allegations made him look like Harvey Weinstein with baby oil. Long before Speaking Out movement exposed him like the world's greasiest men's rights activist, Cornette was screaming, "This guy's ruining wrestling by turning it into clown porn with ropes." Ryan's infamous penis flip spot, where opponents sold his dick like it was Hulk Hogan's comeback, made Cornette snap so hard he nearly started a civil war on Twitter. He went nuclear. This ain't wrestling. This is what happens when virgins book feds for other virgins. If this guy ever worked Memphis in the 80s, Lawler would have had him murdered in a parking lot by the second intermission. After Ryan's career imploded under a mountain of assault allegations and lawsuits, Cornette basically held a fucking celebration. Said it was proof the wrestling gods exist and they hate stupid gimmicks and perverts. He even joked that Joey should try stand-up, because he's already used to dying on stage with his dick out. Jim Cornette hates Kevin Dunn so much, I'm pretty sure he has a voodoo doll with little buck teeth and a lanyard. For Cornette, Dunn isn't just some annoying TV exec. He's the venereal disease of wrestling production, a man who turned sports-based storytelling into a Michael Bay migraine. Dunn was Vince McMahon's right-hand man in production, the guy behind the crash zooms, seizure-inducing camera cuts, and everybody talked like robots while standing in blue light promos. Cornette hated him with the intensity of 1,000 burning Crockett tapes, called him a useless little beaver-toothed prick who doesn't know a wrist lock from a wristwatch, but gets to decide how wrestling looks on TV. Let's be real, Cornette saw Dunn as the piece of shit who had no respect for the business, but got power anyway. Like if your dentist's son took over your wrestling company and started telling Ric Flair to work the TikTok crowd. Worse, Cornette claimed Dunn actively buried talent he didn't like. Supposedly, he tried to block Mick Foley because of his look, and told Becky Lynch she didn't look like a star. If Kevin Dunn doesn't think you're hot enough, you're screwed. Which is rich, coming from a guy who looks like if a chipmunk snorted meth and learned Final Cut Pro. Cornette's knockout line? Kevin Dunn got his job because his daddy worked for Vince. He's a legacy hire with the instincts of a drunk squirrel and the vision of a guy filming a car crash through a kaleidoscope. Jim Cornette sees Kenny Omega as the human equivalent of a melted action figure. All flash, no soul, and he smells vaguely of Axe body spray and unearned smugness. Cornette has called him everything from Kenny Olivier, mocking his artsy, over-choreographed style, to the worst main event talent in wrestling history. He once screamed, "Kenny Omega is what happens when wrestling fans fuck their video game consoles." Cornette's biggest gripe? Omega turned wrestling into performance art. Like ballet, if ballet had trigger fingers and nobody sold a goddamn thing. His famous matches with Okada in New Japan? Cornette said they were 60 minutes of mutual masturbation with a rope break. And then there's the infamous Invisible Man spot, Kenny wrestling a child, or the time he sold for an invisible opponent. Cornette almost had a fucking stroke on air. He wrestled a goddamn blow-up doll. That's not wrestling. That's a cry for help you upload to Pornhub. Cornette also roasted Omega's role in AEW's launch. He said putting Kenny in charge of talent was like handing a loaded gun to a toddler with the hiccups. The guy booked himself as a janitor in a promo and wants to main event with comedy school dropouts. What the fuck happened to wrestling? Kenny's fans will argue, he tells stories. Cornette's comeback? So does Dr. Seuss. Doesn't mean I want him in the fucking main event of Starrcade. And AEW? Cornette believes Omega helped turn it from a revolution into a cartoon. He walks out in feathers, makes gun hands, acts like he's in Dragon Ball Z, and then wrestles a guy in a dinosaur mask. That's not a company. That's a psych ward with entrance music. Jim Cornette doesn't hate Vince Russo. He wants him airlifted to Syria wearing a John Cena shirt and a sign that says, "I hate Allah." If you ask Cornette who ruined wrestling, he won't say the networks or corporate America. He'll scream, "Vince fucking Russo," then spit, bleed, and probably assault a Wendy's cashier just to get it out of his system. Russo was the creative genius behind WWF's Attitude Era. But according to Cornette, he wasn't a booker. He was a crash test dummy with a typewriter and brain damage. This is the guy who booked Mae Young giving birth to a hand, Judy Bagwell on a forklift, and a shoot promo every 9 minutes because he thought realism meant nobody sells anything and everyone says bro like it's Tourette's. Cornette once said Russo's writing was so bad it made the room look like Citizen Kane in trunks, and he meant it. Cornette's knocked him as an illiterate New York goofball who thought wrestling fans wanted Jerry Springer with headlocks. He said Russo had the creative instincts of a syphilitic squirrel on a cocaine bender with a subscription to Hustler and a hatred for logic. "This feud is so personal," Cornette said. "If Vince Russo was on fire, I wouldn't piss on him to put it out. I'd roast marshmallows and write better booking while he screamed." Here's some of Jim Cornette's most infamous quotes on Vince Russo. "The saddest moment in a child's life is not when he learns that Santa Claus isn't real. It's when he learns that Vince Russo is. I started this low-carb, low-sugar diet because I refuse to be outlived by Vince Russo. The grass is greener on the other side. Unless Vince Russo was there, then the grass is probably dead." Or when he said, "Vince Russo destroyed the periodic table as he only recognizes the element of surprise. He is the only booker I've seen who doesn't get people over, he gets them under." Picking out Vince Russo's faults could be a full-time job for somebody. Asshole, dipshit, cocksucker, motherfucker, prick, crook, conman, blithering idiot, Christian. And finally, if Russo and Ferrara are in a room, a city, perhaps even a county I'm working on state, I wouldn't be in it. I was once talked out of taking a baseball bat to Russo by Jim Ross, but I'm not sure I thank him for it. I want Vince Russo to die. If I could figure out a way to murder him without going to prison, I would consider it the greatest accomplishment of my life. These quotes encapsulate the intense animosity Jim Cornette holds towards Vince Russo, reflecting a deep-seated feud that has become legendary in the wrestling community. The bottom line? Cornette hates Vince Russo more than hemorrhoids, Vince McMahon, and God combined. He doesn't want him fired. He wants him unborn. What did we just survive? 5 stages of pure, molten, caffeinated wrath. This wasn't a list. It was a damn hit parade of everything that makes one man's forehead vein twitch like it's trying to escape his skull. This guy doesn't hate people. He marinates in it. He slow cooks that fury in a crock pot for 30 years and serves it up raw on live radio. Every new trend is a personal insult. Every bad idea is a war crime. And every time someone tries to sports entertain, he grabs the mic like it owes him child support. He's not mad because he's old. He's mad because everyone else is stupid. Like and subscribe, or go book a scaffold match between your common sense and a lawnmower. See who bleeds first. Thanks for fucking watching.